Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Alhamdulillah, this is now episode 30 of the podcast of Forward, and we are today going to discuss the topic of prophets and warfare. And today I have a guest, Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali. It's been a year since we last did a podcast together, and we have a series of topics to get through. So without further ado, we will get into the topic of, first, the idea of, can a prophet be a warlord? So Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali, if you could maybe just give a few words of just introduction, and then we'll get into the topic, please.
Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah. Firstly, on the topic, when we talk about can a prophet be a warlord, we have to first of all divest ourselves of any false understandings on what a prophet is, because in the Western world, or the civilizations that follow or have some allegiance, whether it's missing or current to Christendom, their understanding of prophecy and our understanding of prophecy is completely different. So I'll lay out what our understanding of prophecy is in a prophet. A prophet, according to the revealed law, possesses 9 characteristics that are necessary. These characteristics can be summed up in 4 major ways. Number 1, that prophet receives revelation in the form of dreams, which are impossible to ignore, in which they are not hazy or cloudy. Number 2, he receives angelic visits or angelic presences into his life. Number 3, he also receives words of advice directly from the Lord Almighty, in which it is impossible to ignore. It's above the normal 6 senses that we understand. And then finally, he receives revelation, in which he receives a book, which will be either dictated to him or it's brought to him. In the case of Nabiyyuna Musa alayhi salam, this is the understanding of what a prophet is. Now, when we talk about prophets being warlords, this language of a warlord, you have 2 types of linguistics. You have your actual meaning linguistics, where you're looking at the etymological significance of the word. So you have etymological linguistics, in which we're looking at the meaning of a word and its application. So warlord, in the etymological sense, means that someone is the head or temporal master over governance, and has the ability to, or has the right to wage war, so forth. Connotatively, when you hear words like warlord or horde or war master or kingpin or things like this, they're supposed to conjure up negative imagery. I'm assuming in this context we're using etymological linguistics in terms of discussing warlord. So in that sense, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is a warlord in the sense of, etymologically, he wages wars as and when necessary. He has governance, because if a prophet is receiving direct revelation, he's receiving direct information, then that information is a reality. That information is true, and it is the highest level of knowledge possible. So when he receives this information, and when he receives this information that is from the unseen, he then takes that and implements it. And war or other things, I'll give an example of this. From a human standpoint, the things that prophets do are contradictory to what we would normally do as human beings. So when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is mentioned in the Sirah ibn Hisham, when he was told to go to the Quraysh and to say, "O Quraysh, I have not come except to slaughter the Arabs," meaning to destroy their current makeup, how they are organized, that is completely counter to everything that he knows, because he's grown up among these people. They're his uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces. So you can see that there couldn't be an ulterior motive in the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ carrying out many of these campaigns and things that he's doing, because they go against the normal things that we think for a human being. For example, greed, women, love of wealth and power. By carrying out these campaigns, he actually lost friends, he actually suffered injury, and it was going against what he could have done. They even offered him arrangements where they said, well, we'll give you wealth, we'll give you women, we'll make you a king amongst us. And he did the actual opposite of what you would expect in a normal human standpoint.
Okay. So to take that further, and also we have an angles for your audience. How do we understand the figure of Isa alayhi salam, whom we call Isa alayhi salam, and how the Christians, whom they call Jesus, could you first explain our understanding of Isa alayhi salam, and then what is his overall function and mission, and what was his stance regarding warfare, if any?
When we discuss the Messiah, we, as whether we are Muslims or we're Christians, are going to agree upon certain points. We're going to agree that he preached for a number of years, 3 or more, that he ascended, and that he will return at the end of days, in which he will rule or as an absolute king or absolute monarch. Where we start to come into issues is when we discuss matters of combat and warfare. Christians will often say of the Messiah, Nabiyyuna Isa alayhi salam, they will say of the Messiah, we follow his example, in which he wanted nothing to do with war or combat or conflict, whereas the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a warrior, and this is not suited to the world and time in which we currently live. The first problem with that is that smacks of an open submission to the doctrine of what's known as modernism, which we can't give any countenance to that, because you're assuming from the very beginning that the premise of modernism is correct. Number two, all the prophets have the same standard. And even if we use their own book, Christians are often surprised when they come to read in the book of Luke, chapter 23, verse 19, where the Messiah is purported to have said of those who don't believe in his mission or accept him as the Messiah, bring my enemies before me and slay them. Now, this is obviously discussing the fact that if you're refusing to obey a prophet who receives divine revelation as an authority and speaks on behalf of the Lord Almighty, that obviously you're in direct combat with the Lord Almighty. We also have to understand that the Messiah in his first dispensation was coming with an open call. Mm-hmm. In the end times, all the information that we have in Revelation is that he's coming to rule as a king. Before that occurs, there are some 5 to 10 ahadith that list him entering into open combat, and that he will be victorious over his enemies by supplication and also force, and that they will be subdued. And if that's the case, and that's what we understand, then the world around us is completely different to what the revelation has actually told us. Now, someone could say on the flip side of that, well, in the world that we live in, shouldn't we be focused on bringing people together and bringing people into a more peaceful era, and an era of peace, because the Messiah was one of peace and he never lifted his sword against anyone? In his first dispensation, that's correct. But the second dispensation, that shall not be the case. And the Messiah's second coming will be a global event in which the whole world shall be changed, and everything that we think we know about the Messiah will be laid bare and exposed.
Okay, so then, so what about if we take that further, and then how about comparing our understanding in the Qur'an of previous prophets and messengers, and then what Christians will understand from their Bible and when their engagement in warfare? So top of the list that comes to mind would be Musa alayhi salam.
Okay, so what Christians will often have an understanding of is that they say that the Old Testament is of types and shadows, and that the New Testament is fulfilled in Christ, and that we're only to follow that message. And thus they've interpreted, some of them, especially in the outcome of the Protestant Reformation, that the state is not under the service of religion, but religion's under the service of the state. So they interpret and understand that those were things that were done away with. They are abrogated, they are the past. Whereas for Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in the hadith in the Sunnah of Abu Dawood, he said, Allah has declared jihad is permitted for me from the time he sent me as a prophet until the last of my ummah shall fight the false Messiah. Perhaps a more easy comparison between Muslims and Christians would be the figure of Nabiuna Musa alayhi salam, because he was engaged and commanded to engage in combat. And our scholars explain to us that the very first of prophets commanded to engage in combat was Nabiuna Musa alayhi salam. Prior to that time, prophets were told to engage in open preaching. But as prophets began to be killed, kingdoms became stronger and more wicked. Then Allah the Exalted commanded us to use warfare as a means of defense and also as the establishment of justice in the land. So, when you look at the case of Nabiuna Musa alayhi salam, we find examples where it's listed in the wars that are in the book of what Christians call their Exodus, stories that are purportedly mentioning Nabiuna Musa alayhi salam in long-term warfare, in which at one point he's lifting his hands in supplication, and as long as his hands are lifted in supplication, he is victorious in war. But then when he lowers his hands, his troops start to flag in their strength and they start to lose. So one person comes on each side, what's purported to be Nabiuna Harun alayhi salam and his sister Miriam alayhi salam, and they each hold one arm up until they're victorious. And he had the best part of almost 27 battles to secure the land of Israel and to secure the children of Israel so that they could have a foothold in the country they came to call the Holy Land.
Okay. So the next question that this leads to is, when looking at Christianity, is there a different understanding in terms of how the Eastern Church and the Western Church view the figure of Isa alayhi salam, of the Messiah, and then subsequently of warfare?
The answer to that question is a yes and a no, because there's many parts to it. I think the easiest way to answer it would be in this way. Martin Luther is the most important figure in Western Christendom because it represents a break between the Catholic Church in the West and the Catholic Church in the East, and then finally a break of Protestantism from the Eastern churches altogether. Martin Luther was the first, and those after him, such as Zwingli, Knox, and others, were the first ones to say that Christendom did not have a voice to say with regards to political affairs, governance, and ruling, but rather its mission was primarily spiritual, and that you are to submit yourself to your temporal rulers. Previous to that time, the Eastern churches, such as the Russian Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, the Ethiopian Tawhid Coptic Orthodox, had a doctrine known as the Church Militant. And this is a word that's used by the Protestants, but they think it refers to the missionary militant. But in reality, it refers to according to the Eastern churches, the church militant in a military martial sense. So you'll see pictures of Russian Orthodox priests blessing soldiers as they're marching out in battle. You'll see Coptic Orthodox blessing soldiers as they're marching out. Coptic Orthodox referring to combat in its true sense of the word and saying, put on the whole armor of Christ and march out. And they mean it in its most literal sense. So with the onset of the Protestant Reformation from the 1400s onwards, that change brought on a doctrinal change. And Christians are still in the midst of this discussion. So Christians that are from the United Kingdom or the Christians that are from the United States have this issue in their hearts of, is there such thing as a good war? Does God love war? Now for the Muslim, the question is very simple, that Allah does love war when it's in His cause, because of Surah Al-Saf, the opening passage, إن الله يحب الذين يقاتلون في سبيله صفا كأنهم بنيان مرصوص. Indeed, Allah loves those who fight in His cause, standing together in ranks as if they're a solid block.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. I think that's quite clear. So then, obviously, I think the next question that comes up here, especially for angles for your listeners, was how do we address this issue when Muslims are constantly accused of, or Islam is said to have spread by the sword? How do we address this issue?
Okay. When we talk about Islam being spread by the sword, that's one of those answers that's one of those yes-no answers again, because there's some truth in the statement, but then there's also some falsehood in it as well. When we talk about Islam being spread by the sword, we have to keep in mind that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he had a dispensation that was split in two. The first was to the world at large, and then the second was to the Arabs in particular. It is to the Arabs in particular that he said in the hadith in the Sahih Imam Muslim, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Umirtu an uqatil an-nas hatta yashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadur Rasulullah." I was ordered to fight the people until they say that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, establish the prayer and give the zakat. And when they do that, their blood and wealth are protected from me, and except what the right of Islam requires, and وَحِسَابُهُمْ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, and their reckoning is with Allah the Exalted. Imam al-Nawawi, as well as al-Mazidi, say that the Nas there is talking about the Arabs, because it was unacceptable that the Arabs, who were the children of Ismail and are the sons of covenant, that they would remain worshipping idols, and that they would be allowed to do so and be given any type of reservation whatsoever. So they're supposed to know better, and they will be fought against in that vein. Now, when talking about the world at large, there was a difference, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when dealing with the world at large and the rest of the Muslims, are dealing with the world in which they're encountering Christians and others. If the command, as some people claim, that the Muslims were spreading Islam by the sword and it was killing, then why did the Muslims not kill John of Damascus, known as Saint John of Damascus, the Arab Christian theologian, who wrote his famous book, The Institutes, known as the Destur? Why didn't they kill him? Because he clearly wrote in that book, and it was circulated all around Syria, Damascus, and around, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a renegade cardinal from the Latin Church that set up a heresy from a demon that he was inspired by, and this came to be known as Islam, and that the Qur'an was the devil's book, and that he is one of the signs of the coming age of the false papacy and all these other things. This was circulated in Greek as well as Arabic. So if Islam was spread by the sword, then it stands to reason that he should have been killed. We also have to remember, when people are saying Islam was spread by the sword, look at what's happening in the Middle East now, all the Christians are leaving. Well, wait a minute. If all the Christians are leaving, it would mean that they were there before. And the idea of saying that, well, Islam, it's only about convert or die. Well, then why are there all these Christians in the Middle East, especially in the Arab world? Why is it that the two most important Christian holy sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ is purported to have been laid after his crucifixion, and the Church of the Nativity, where both Muslims and Christians agree that he was born and where he was placed at? Why are those main structures there? They've suffered more damage under Israeli occupation than they have under the whole 1400 years of Muslims. Then we have Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, some of the highest population areas where no Muslim armies ever came to those areas. In fact, it had to do with trade. Sri Lanka, Madagascar, all these areas where the Muslims had reached, where no armies were sent, this was merchant work. So the idea that Islam spread by the sword is completely fallacious. Now, someone will say, well, wait a minute. What about the armies that made it to Egypt and to Libya, to Armenia, to Azerbaijan? That's correct nonetheless. But those armies, when they reached there, they opened up those countries to have the preaching of Islam. Now, if the people didn't want Islam, then they weren't forced in that sense to take Islam. They would either pay the jizya, which is a right that's owed, in which they would be exempt from military service and other things, but they weren't forced to become Muslims. Because if they were forced to become Muslims, convert or die, why is 20% of Egypt Christian? Why is it that Egypt has one of the most decorated collections of Hebrew and Ladino, which is Arabic written in Hebrew, manuscript collections in the Geniza in Cairo, in the whole of Jewish antiquity? Why is it that there are huge Jewish communities in Morocco and in Libya and in Tunis and these other areas? Yes, those people are leaving now, but that's because of violence. That's not that people are getting back to the original Islam, because if the original Islam was violent and spread by the sword, then those people wouldn't be there at all today. As a final point in summing this up, I'd say this. Why is it, this is just a question for people who are thinking from the Latin Rite Christianity or Protestant, the most important sacred structures of Christendom stand today in the Muslim world, in the heart of the Muslim world. But any masjids or places of worship that were in the heartland Christian world are museums or are cathedrals today. Why is that?
And I'll reward you. Thank you for that answer. I think also another thing to add, I remember Imam Muhammad Sayyid Ramadan Bolti in his book on the topic of jihad, again, that same hadith, uqatil al-nas, he also points out that even if you were to take nas and you were to apply it to all of humanity, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he didn't say, I was commanded to kill people until they said la ilaha illallah. I was commanded to fight people, and fighting is reciprocal.
Yes.
So the idea there is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the believers, are commanded to preach the faith, and then if they are met with force, then they have to respond with force.
Yes.
So that's perfectly applicable. And also to add to the point about, because there are a lot of people who try to argue, this is on sort of like the white fluffy teddy bear end of the spectrum. They try to argue that Muslims, they would only fight in self-defense, but self-defense doesn't mean that you're just waiting patiently until the enemy's right at the door. But Muslims would also engage in intelligence gathering, spying on enemies, maintaining their interests, and then they would engage in preemptive warfare if necessary. If you could just elaborate on that, please.
I mean, sure. If you look in the books of fiqh, the books of law of the Muslims, irrespective of any of the four schools, if you look in either of the four schools, when you come to a chapter, it may be either Qitab, the chapter of fighting and combat. It might be called Kitab al-Harb, the book of warfare. It might be called Kitab al-Jihad, the book of jihad. But you'll find that there are two definitions. You have your Qitali, which is offensive, and your Difa'i, which is Difa'i. So those that say that it's only defensive, that's incorrect, because all the scholars from the early ages all the way up into ours have two definitions of this type of fighting, in which it is either offensive, Qitali, or it is defensive, Difa'i. And it has its rulings and times and when it becomes applicable and when it's not applicable.
Yeah, because also you have the Bab al-Sa'il as well. Like that, you have that's a separate Bab altogether. Like when you're actually attacked,
Yes.
you have to ward off an aggressor.
Yes.
And that doesn't require the permission of a ruler or anything like that.
No, those are things that you take on immediately. Like if your land is suddenly invaded, you don't wait for someone to tell you that it's fine to engage in combat to defend yourself. You defend yourself immediately because you are a mutanad and nifsik. You are leader of your own self in that circumstance, and you have to defend yourself.
Okay, and I think from this we can understand that this religion of peace moniker that's always attached to Islam that Muslims try to promote doesn't really have a base. Do you have any further details as to where this actually came from? This title, religion of peace?
Okay, the idea religion of peace. There were two important terms that came when Islam started to be whitewashed in the Anglosphere Western world. There's two important terms. Abrahamic religion and religion of peace, and Islam means peace. These three terms. All three of these terms, the earliest I've been able to trace them to is to a man named Ismail al-Faruqi, who was Mu'tazila in his theology, so he belonged to a cult, he was a cultist. And his whole point of bringing this together was to try to make Islam more palatable to a wider audience. So he would eschew and undermine things like having a beard or wearing the clothes of the Muslims and the Sunni clothes, the imamate of things. These were undermined. He made it a point to go bareheaded and to wear a suit with pinstripes and a tie and these other types of things. Tragically, he was murdered in his own home. He and his wife, and if memory serves me correct, his children. But the stain that he left behind is what we have to contend with today. That was extremely important when the Vatican called the Parliament of World Religions. And then there was the Assisi, the Assisi delegation. Both of those were extremely important because there'd be no way to have a world prayer day in which you had the medicine men smoking their pipes, the Buddhists doing their chanting of Nam Ho Yoden Yekyo, the Hindus passing out the lote leaves, all these people coming together making this cacophony of foolishness. None of that would have been possible to have a delegation saying we're a Muslim delegation unless you started off with the trilogue of Abrahamic faiths, which was his coming out book, this most sophomore book. And that gave this whole idea that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all coming from this trilogue of Abrahamic faiths. They're all Abrahamic religions. He's the one that started this. And the idea of Islam means peace was a way of subjugating and also weakening Islam's stance so it could be held on par with Christendom and Judaism, which in order to practice them in this standpoint of the countries out here to the people that have reconciled to the world, it was to gut them of their essential aspects, one of which is exclusive theology, in which there is only one correct way, and also the right of self-defense and combat.
Yeah, and I think I will put an article below about this, about religion of peace, because this is also an issue that Imam Muhammad Sayyid al-Bolti and Imam Mahmoud Zuhaili, they first started talking about the 1960s, and they basically said that what we're going to see, and you have to think this is Maraja, this is authorities, this is how they think, and they said in the 1960s that you would see, coming out of the West, you would see some people who would make this claim, and they would say that, oh, Islam and jihad, this is just, it's terrorism, it's murder, it's raping, it's pillaging, it's destruction. And then before Muslims would be able to formulate any sort of intelligent response, you would have other people out in the Anglosphere come forward and say, no, Islam means peace, Islam is religion of peace, and the Muslims would get sucked into that argument and just go with it. So therefore you're just stuck with these two extremes. Either Islam is terrorism and it's like ISIS or whatever, or it's the big white fluffy teddy bear.
Yeah, so either Islam is ineffectual, in which case it has nothing to offer the world other than empty platitudes, or it's all combat and killing. And neither of those extremes are correct. There is a such thing, because if a prophet is coming and a prophet receives revelation and he is governing with that revelation, there's a part of that governance that's societal. Now, the only option we have when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes back on the 17th of Ramadan, 8 years after the Hijrah, or 630 AD, when he destroyed those idols and purified the sanctuary of all wickedness and falsehood, either he's guilty of breaking and entering in strong-arm robbery and destroying a World Heritage Site, or he did exactly what his Lord told him to do, and he stood firm against idolatry. There's a such thing as objective truth. There's absolute truth and absolute falsehood, and he did as he was commanded and purified the sanctuary. Those are the only two choices we're left with.
Okay. I think at that point, so from that standpoint, I think if we could just get into a slight elucidation of another major difference between us and the Christians is the understanding of what they call church and state, or the role of governance, the fact that Islam is not meant to be, it's not a private religion that's completely detached from political matters.
When we discuss this with Christians, and this is primarily speaking of Christians who are Protestant and Second Vatican Catholics, Latin Rite Catholics. I make this distinction because previous to the Second Vatican Council, the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church, which has 7 rites, was heavily involved in the state. It governed, it had power, to the point that it fought Mussolini to a stalemate. And Mussolini, in return for having him being recognized as his area, would not tamper with Vatican interests and would allow the Vatican to act independently as a separate nation, as it had been for all that time. For Protestantism, it starts with Martin Luther. And and one of the areas this started was Martin Luther, when he declared that the state, which at that point was the church, cannot control people's salvation, and that salvation is a private and individual matter. People also took part in the peasant revolt, and Luther inadvertently was the inspiration for the peasant revolt. So all of these peasants rose up against the gentry and the aristocracy and everything else. When that happened, Luther was so taken aback, not realizing that he was part of that issue. He was so taken aback without realizing he was an inspiration that he sent a letter to the governors of his area telling them to smite and strike with forces and strike with their force the rebels and the enemies to their own selves, and to leave none standing. And so what happened? The peasants were ultimately viciously massacred, down to a man. But it set, now Martin Luther, whether he meant that on purpose or accidentally, he set the course for this separation. Then you had a series of wars, the 100 Years' War. Then you had the Huguenots, which were slaughtered viciously. All these battles back and forth to try to wrest authority away from the church. And then eventually you had the separation between the church, because as the Catholic Church had said, that there was one holy, universal Catholic Church. This is how it began. Now, by the time the Founding Fathers came about, Founding Fathers came to the United States with a secular mindset of establishing a civilization that was free of religion. People had whatever religion they had, but that religion must be subservient to the state and governance. So religion must be muzzled, and if possible, gutted and made submissive to the state. For Muslims, it's problematic because they say, well, there needs to be separation between mosque and state. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. State affairs aren't governed from the masjid. So this is sort of this Catholic or Protestant idea creeping in among Muslims. It's like Muslims don't govern from masjids. They govern from either the residence of the Khalifa or what have you, or the Maraji, as they have a majlis or a council. But the idea of governance, al-Hukumat al-Islamiyya, Muslim governance or Islamic governance, is something that's impossible to ignore. There is no way to implement the revealed law in totality without governing. There's no way to universally distribute zakah without governance. There is no way to, because mainly people tend to focus on the penal laws. But let's talk about things like land, like when land needs to be rotated, because land has to be rotated every 7 years, and then it's given 1 year to rest, 6 years rotated. Those massive jobs aren't possible. Laying aqueducts, all these other things you require government to do these other things. Guarding storerooms so that people don't break in and steal crops or steal the seeds that are kept in storage silos. All these things require governance. And Islam has lengthy things that deal with the topic of governance and treat topics such as agriculture and crops and warfare and penal laws and marriage and divorce and buying, selling, renting, all these things. So it's impossible to say that Islam has nothing to do with these matters when there are books, volumes upon volumes upon volumes, that have treated these matters for centuries, millennia.
So to add to that, so again, because what happens a lot is someone in the Anglosphere, someone who's not a Muslim in the Anglosphere, they'll flip through the Qur'an and they'll find all these verses that talk about violence and warfare and kill these people and smite these people, but if you can't really understand those verses if you see them in isolation from the fact that Islam has a system of governance. That's where they have to be put in. These are verses of warfare.
That's true, and then you also have to keep in mind that the Quran is different to all the previous revelations that were given. The Torah that was given to Nabiyyuna Musa alayhi salam was revealed in one instant and handed to him, and as the slabs or the tablets. Nabiyyuna Isa alayhi salam received it in one moment. Nabiyyuna Ibrahim alayhi salam received the Suhuf in one moment. The Quran was revealed over 23 years. So someone cannot merely read through the Quran as they would the newspaper or the TV guide or a Reader's Digest condensation of a major novel and just come to a conclusion on governance matters. Now, someone can read through the Quran in terms of day-to-day advice on behavior. They can read through the Quran for devotional purposes and for general halal and haram, what's impermissible, what's not impermissible, for eating and drinking, theology. One can do that. But when you talk about the mechanics of governance, it requires you to have a far deeper mind, impact, experience, and knowledge of revealed law before you merely pick up this revelation of raw data and start using it in that way.
Right, because also you have this instance, like for example, is it Surah At-Tawbah ayah 5 that they always quote as the ayah of the sword?
Yes. It's said, kill the idol worshippers wherever you find them, lay hold to them, besiege them. Now that ayah, it's always very strange because they don't read the very beginning, which runs, Allah and His Messenger are free of those who broke their treaty in the year that they did so. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not talking about the local man that lives in El Paso, Texas. He didn't have any treaty with Allah and the Messenger. Then it runs on to say further, when the holy months have elapsed, it's like the holy months have elapsed. Was the Byzantine Empire under the holy months? And a treaty that was running over it? No. So it's not them. Then you kill it. So these are time-specific verses that are not for Johnny Appleseed from Corpus Christi, Texas, or for Leanne Matthews who lives in Corvallis, Oregon, or Bend. It's not for these particular people. These verses are connected to certain events and times and come into impact and effect as and where they belong.
And then you have the verse after that, because ayah 6 isn't ayah 6 say that, and if one of them seek refuge in you.
Yes, then provide it to them so that they might hear the words of Allah, and then provide them safe passage. Safe passage where? Back to where they came from. So it's obvious that it can't mean kill every single one. Talking about the treaty breakers.
Yeah, so it's quite awkward how someone can look at ayah 5 and completely miss the preceding and following ayah.
Well, part of that has to do with people. When people say, I've read the Quran, I know what it means. What they mean is they've looked up certain keywords where they've said, okay, violence in Quran. They've just looked it up and gone on a website. No, to read a book is to read it from cover to cover. That's actually reading. When I say I've read the Bible, I've read the Douay Rhymes, I've read the King James, I've read the Ethiopic, I've read the Bible from cover to cover. So I don't make simple mistakes like that. I wouldn't think ever that a Christian believes that olive trees waving in the wind really were speaking to the Lord Almighty in discernible language. I would understand that that's obviously a metaphor. I would never come to the realization that when it's purported that Nabiyyuna Isa alayhi salam says, if your right eye offendeth thee, then pluck it out. That means that you gouge your eye out. And that if your hand offendeth thee, then hack it off. I would not assume that if someone has a problem with fornication, that their hand necessarily must be removed. And if they have a problem looking at porn or looking at other things, that their eye must be gouged out in order for them to be a consistent, upright Christian. I understand what metaphors are. I understand what ellipses are. I understand what exaggerated texts are used to bring home a certain point. And we have to understand it's the same thing in every matter. Even if we're not talking about revelation, the Constitution has certain things, certain expressions in it that require understanding. Now, the Quran is revelation. It's certainly greater than the Constitution. But the point of the matter is when you are examining a text, you have to examine the text and examine it fully. So you have a proper, voluminous, full, and universal understanding of what's at stake. Otherwise, you fall into textualism. And that's when you go astray.
Yeah, it's like a confirmation bias. You're actually looking for something. Because aren't Anglosphere Muslims then, aren't they sort of digging a hole for themselves because they don't want to talk about the governance issue? So they're kind of stuck when they're asked these questions. What about these verses?
Well, what happens is the people who would deign themselves as the spokesman for Islam live on the hope and prayer that people who aren't Muslim never read the Quran cover to cover. Because as long as they have that, they have political rhetoric, emotional arguments that if you don't believe like we believe, you're racist. Hey, you can't say that you think Islam is violent, you're racist. As long as they count on those things and people don't read the Quran, they never have to craft and form a cogent argument. As long as they never have to do that, they can continue to be as mentally lazy as they want. But the problem is that people who aren't Muslim are reading the Quran cover to cover. And their questions are justified. They can be answered. But their questions are justified because they're coming across things and not understanding how matters are implemented. And then we also have a series of wayward children who are the children of these spokesmen for Islam who are doing many of these killings because they're reading the Quran in the same newspaper Time magazine style as their unbelieving friends. And so they're sort of creating this self-fulfilling prophecy because they're reading it in the same fashion as their friends, Islam for Dummies style, and carrying out attacks. And so much of this firmly is placeable upon the shoulders of those who love to refer to themselves as the spokesman for Islam or the voice of Islam and other self-congratulatory titles.
And that's not even an exaggeration. So Daniel Hand did write an article about a couple of guys from the UK who did try to join ISIS, and it was shown in their accounts that they had ordered Islam for Dummies from Amazon to read.
Yes, because they're from that same environment where they've been through the same school system, they've been subjected to the same mental tactics where they've been broken down and they read everything literal. These schooling systems that they're being put through have taught them to read everything literal. They don't know what similes are. They don't know what metaphors are. They don't know what comparative study means. They don't know what cross-referencing means. They don't understand what mutashabihat ayat, because there's two types of mutashabih, where you have mutashabih ayat that speak of the same topic in terms of judgment, and that so what you do is you gather together all the data on a topic. Then you read that data, and then you sift and understand it, and then you reach a conclusion. They're not doing that. They're just reading it like they would a newspaper, as the Daily Metro or the USA Today, and then saying, well, that's it. I've got to go out and start killing my local greengrocer and my onion seller. And it's not like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is even deliberate, because I know John Taylor Gatto in his book Dumbing Us Down, he actually said that, because he was a New York City teacher for about 30 years, and he won awards, and he said that I teach I think the disjointedness of everything. Like the whole point of the school system, the way it's set up, is that everything is detached, separated, disjointed, dismembered, and students are never given any sort of tools or even an inkling of understanding that the subjects you're studying have any connection to each other. They're constantly just kept separate from each other.
They're keeping them in different hemispheres. They're separating all the subjects into different hemispheres, so they never have the opportunity of seeing knowledge. Knowledge is a contiguous whole. It can be broken into parts, but it's a contiguous whole. Like an apple. The apple is composed of the seed, the skin, the inner core. It's got the root on the outside. Has all these other things that it's connected to, but the apple is a contiguous whole. To fail to understand that is to fail to accurately gather knowledge. And it's for this reason that I've started to put together a series of lessons on how to read a book. Because it has to be retaught again how to read a book. What does a synopsis of a book teach you? What does an introduction teach you? There's many people who open any book, they don't read the preface, they don't read the introduction, they go straight into the book without realizing that the about this book, the preface and the introduction are precisely what are going to help you and assist you in understanding the book and properly applying it.
Yeah. Also, I should add that yes, Imam al-Bulti in his book, the approach to human civilization, the Qur'an, which I just translated, inshallah, it'll be published soon. He has a whole section there called "What is Knowledge in the Qur'an." And he talks about how what's happened a lot of time with so-called scientists, philosophers of the West, like Bertrand Russell or Albert Einstein, is they've done a lot of research into one little field, and they haven't actually looked at the whole picture and looked at the bigger picture, and therefore they come out at the end of it after years and years of studying and research saying, I still don't get it, I still don't understand, or they come to some sort of completely erroneous conclusion. And he said that it's the likeness, just like looking at a map. Like you can't use a map unless you know how the map works in terms of the cardinal directions, in terms of the lines of latitude and longitude. If you just take a microscope and you zoom in on one river or one town, yes, you know the name of that river, and that could be quote-unquote scientific knowledge, but it's useless in the sense that you don't know how it relates to everything else on the map.
Right.
So I think the next thing that to come up, to bring up, which is another thing that sort of what's the word? An aside that is thrown at Muslims is this idea that we struggled from the very beginning. As soon as the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right after that there was disunity, and we had the Sunni Shia divide, and it's this perpetual civil war that's been going on, and Christianity, for example, has not had similar issues. This is an aside that's thrown at us.
The problem with this is on many different levels. The problem with this thinking. Number one, there's no Sunni Shia divide. The Shia are between 7 to 10% of all Muslims worldwide. People who call themselves Salafis or what they're called Wahhabis, they're even a smaller number than that. Aberrant Sunnis, whether they're the Al-Handis or Rebels, they're even smaller numbers than that. They're a tiny section of the worldwide body of 1.5 billion Muslims. A very tiny body. So there is no divide, because a divide assumes, when you use that word divide in English, it assumes that something can be put in like two halves. There's no way Shia even stack up anywhere near the Sunnis, who were the first and the largest, and have been the largest body of Muslims throughout history. If you were to ask about some great structures and architecture of the Muslims, you would think of the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa, both of which were built by Sunnis. Most people, if you ask them, can you name some great Shia structures historically? Can you name some great Shia empires? They can't think of any because their significance is very, very small. And most of the Shia empires we know of came to power or came to their apex through assassination of Sunni rulers. Now, that being said, when someone makes that comment, there's a problem that's there, as we just mentioned. And it's this understanding. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, it took the Muslims 3 days to bury him. And as we know, we said in the Hadith Imam Suyuti's collection, that don't bury me immediately, allow the angels to minister over me and pray upon me. His body didn't decay, it didn't erode, it didn't go through the normal process of rigor that non-prophets' bodies go through. So when they buried him on that Wednesday, he was buried, and then the Muslims set about, because they had to concern themselves with dealing with the matters of governance and what should happen after that, which they did. And Abu Bakr governed, then after him, after his 2 years, came Omar for 10, then Uthman for 12, and then Ali for 5 years and 6 months, and then Al-Hassan for 6 months. Then came Muawiyah, because there was argument regarding Uthman's murder, because Uthman was murdered by a cult. And then that year that Muawiyah became the leader and ruled for 19 years, that was called the Year of Togetherness. So this idea that there was this sort of constant division among Muslims up until now, then how did the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, the Jami Bani Umayyah, Al-Azhar, the Zaytuna, the 70 hospitals in Baghdad, the Qarawiyyin, how did all these structures get built if there was this even divide and there was never anything being built? Where did all these scientific manuals come from? It's clear that there was constant building going on. Now, for someone to say that Christendom did not have this issue, or that people in the West didn't have this issue, I would ask, have they ever heard of the 100 Years' War? Have they ever heard of the war that occurred between the Huguenots and others, where the Huguenots were invited to a wedding because they were supposed to marry in and end the Catholic Protestant divide. And what happened is that woman acted as a decoy, and almost every single Huguenot was cut down and killed at a wedding. Then we also have the Plymouth Brethren having to leave to seek refuge somewhere else because of the persecution and all the things going on. Then we have two of the Crusades, the 250 years worth of Crusades. Two of them were connected to the Albigenses as well as the Anabaptists and the killing of the Anabaptists. Then we have when John Calvin took over Geneva and declared God's kingdom, and Michael Servetus was put to the stake and burned. Then we have the second suppression of the Anabaptists. Then we have the suppression of the Mennonites and all this. I mean, it's not been an open book where everything has been fine and happy. Then we have where the Latin Rite Christians came down during the Crusades, reached Jerusalem, and slaughtered the Eastern Orthodox Christians. It's for this reason why the Latin Church doesn't have a place at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They don't have a prayer niche there. They're not included. And the Protestant churches, they're not even viewed as Christians.
Okay.
Then you have the Council of Trent and the situation with the Council of Trent and them dealing with Protestants. There's a complete disconnect there.
You just reminded me of a question actually that comes up. This is another thing that people, a recent idea that's come out of the Anglosphere, this idea that the Crusades were an act of self-defense. This is what certain Anglosphere people are saying.
Well, there's a problem. There's a problem with the thinking because it assumes that Christians are all one body. What triggered the crusade that brought Latin Rite Christians, the Teutons and other types of Christians from Germany and others down, was Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far, who was an Ismaili, and the Ismaili Shia formed an empire called the Fatimiyya that ruled North Africa. Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far was governor over Egypt and declared himself deity, and that all the dogs of Egypt should be killed. Mulukhiyya was declared outlawed, as well as the round Lebanese bread. It's unknown the reasoning for that, but when you're deity, I suppose you can proclaim what you want to. Then he had someone go and try to destroy the altar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which damaged about a third of the building. News of this got back to Europe. Now remember, the Eastern Orthodox Christians and all the ones there, they didn't do anything because they understood that Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far was a sick man, that he didn't represent the Muslims, and that he didn't represent the best of the Muslims. They understood this. So no harm came to them. Their issue was they wanted the expiation paid for those that had died in the fire, and they also wanted the structure repaired, which it was. Christians then swept down, Latin Rite Christians from Western Europe swept down, on the way killing Byzantine Rite Catholics, came to Antioch, killed the Muslims and the Byzantine Rite Catholics, made it to Jerusalem, killed the Muslims, the Jews, Eastern Orthodox, Coptic Rite, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Antiochian, Maronite, and ate some of them. So how that was viewed as a defensive battle is bizarre to me, because there was nothing defensive when you've never been in charge of maintaining the Holy Sepulchre or Church of the Nativity. How could it be defensive for Latin Rite Christians to be coming into an Eastern Orthodox or Greek or Syrian or Antiochian or even Nestorian, Middle East and Africa? How could that possibly be defensive?
Yeah, I also think people, what these Western people tend to forget is they also said that, with the papal bulls issued in 1095 in their calendar, and then, but 1066 is when you actually had the Great Schism, when the Eastern Orthodox churches and then the Latin Rites went their separate ways. So there was already division between them. So these Latin Rite Christians would not necessarily even identify with these Christians living in the Middle East. And
in fact, the Eastern ones considered many of them still today. They're patriarchs. The Autocephalous patriarchs consider them heretics.
Yeah, the filioque issue.
Yeah, there's the filioque. There's also the Kama Yohanian. There's all these types of issues that exist between them. So how on earth you'd say that we're doing a defensive rearguard action, that somehow the Middle East has been sort of Latin Catholic, is completely misrepresenting history. Even I've said this to Sergeant Interrupt. I've even said this: when someone debates with a Muslim that's a Protestant, my advice to that Muslim is to always say, why would you try to argue with me as a Protestant when at the time that my prophet brought the revelation, you didn't exist? Where was your Christendom during that time? Bring me the Eastern Orthodox, the Ethiopian, bring me them. Because they're going to have a bigger handle on the issue than you. You're not coming with a 500-year-old Christendom. You're a Wesleyan. You're a Methodist. You're a Baptist, Church of God in Christ, or you're Anglican, or Episcopalian, or the other titles that are used, Congregationalist. Don't come to me with these people, because they don't even exist at that time. So bringing in like Calvinist arguments on doctrine when Calvin lived 500 years ago.
Okay, may Allah reward you. I think we've covered all the major issues. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that point?
What I would say is, what I would add in sort of closing is, I would say for people who are listening to read with a critical eye. To read with a critical eye. When you read about Islam and Muslims, and when you read about these type of matters, to have a critical eye on both sides. When you hear someone proclaim himself as the spokesman for Islam, and that all jihad in Islam is only a physical matter in which someone's fighting against himself, know that that man is not telling the full truth. But on the other end of it, when you hear a man say that Islam is all violence, it's never brought the world anything, it's just been a case of perpetual warfare, those people have been fighting each other for thousands of years. When you hear that, know that that's an untruth as well. And that the balance, the facts of the matter remain in the middle of all of that mess. And out of that, when you study and you research and you examine, that is when you can find the truth of a matter. Okay. The truth of a matter always remains between two extremes.
Okay, well, I'll reward you. So, before we finish and closing, could you please give us a few details, like websites and so forth, where to find your work, and also about current projects that you're engaged in? Okay, the place where people can find, I have 3 places where I publish material. The first is georgis.wordpress.com. Now that I put up articles of things that are going on, sometimes translations of things that are in Arabic, or maybe every now and then Spanish and other things. I put up articles. I'll often insert statements or things that I think are useful on a topic. It is open-handed, it's hard-hitting. I tend to publish all comments, whether they're harsh or not. It's just an open forum where I sort of discuss with my subscribers and the world at large about matters going on in the world that pertain to Muslims and even people who aren't Muslim. Then we have meerath.infofeed, meerath, meerath.info, I-N-F-O, fiend, F-I-E-N-D.org. What this is a long time ago, some of my colleagues came to me in faith and said it would be good if there was a repository where rulings were put up of the authorities of Islam who have global jurisdiction in affairs temporal and spiritual. If those rulings could be put somewhere where they were organized in a systematic fashion that we could read through them again and again, is there something we can do? And the meerath was, which means inheritance, the meerath was the realization
of that dream, the realization of that hope. So there we have the rulings of people such as Imam al-Buti or Wahb al-Suhaili or Abdul Rahman al-Shami, other high-ranking Muraja, Grand Muraja people, and we put these rulings up there on matters, global matters that affect Muslims. And even it's for even people who aren't Muslim, they can take a read of it and get a really good understanding of how the authority structure in Islam works. We've tried to make sure that it's very user-friendly, that it's active, that there's photos of the great bulk of the Marja people there. What is a Marja? What is the Marja system? How does it work? Why is this important? What's authority in Islam? How does this work? So people get a sense of how Muslim orthodoxy, or the Arabic, the full Arabic, Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or the abbreviated Sunni, how these theologians, how the religion has been handed down infallibly and it's reached us up until today. As for the blog that I do, jurjis.wordpress.com. Then there's the YouTube page, which is the Reasons for Faith. Now, the Reasons for Faith, that is the reasons for, which is the number 4, faith. If that's put into YouTube, it should bring up the page. That deals with lectures that I will do that are usually translations from the Arabic, or I will read from the Arabic and translate it real time. We've got a number of really high profile and unique lectures that have been put up. I was able and blessed to complete the entire tafseer of Imam al-Jawzi, so the entire commentary on the Qur'an from the first surah all the way to the last is available soon. Most of it's been put up. Lectures where I've explained to Christians about Islam. Lectures on the dangers of witchcraft or cults or magic and these other things. There's possibly maybe 100 different subjects that are there that we've tried to cover in a very systematic but gritty and engaging style. With regard to written material, years ago we were able to publish 6 works. But the complaint that many of my colleagues, especially my Arab co-religionists, many of their complaints were because the Arabic was not inserted. And so the first edition of all these books I've gone back over, and I've started the painstaking task of inserting the Arabic text so that you'll have a paragraph of Arabic and then right under it is the translation of English. The first successful project was the second edition of A Word of Advice by Imam Wafquddin ibn Qudama, and the translation or the Arabic insertion was successful. And so we wanted this to be there for people who were Arab readers or people who want to work on their Arabic, people who enjoy the aesthetic aspect of Arabic. Word of Advice covers an introduction to purification of the heart and righteousness and good character. The book after that we're looking to do the second edition for is the Divine Texts, and this is the order that I originally published them in. The Divine Texts is an exposition by the author, Imam Mustafa ibn Ahmad al-Shatti, the great Marja from Syria, who, when seeing the rise of Salafiyya, also known as Khawarij, or in its current incarnation, Daesh or ISIS, when he saw them entering into Syria in earnest, he wrote this text against them. And this book, when it was first released in English, there was a groundswell of opposition to it. And it was mainly by Muslims who sought to try to cover up and ignore this disease that's happening in their midst. So the second edition of that is due soon. It's currently out of print. The third text is the Divine Lightning, which is written against the founder of Salafiyya and the reviver of the Khawarij doctrine of today, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, by his elder brother. There are quotes from close to 100 other scholars in that time period establishing the consensus that Salafiyya has nothing to do with Islam. It's not from revelation. And this is extremely important for someone who is asked often by people who are not Muslim, well, where's the condemnation of terrorism? Where's the condemnation of these elements? Here you have a 300-year-old condemnation. That's a consensus that this has nothing to do with our religion. And the author, who was captured on the battlefield resisting Salafiyya, was pretty much tortured to death. And most of those who opposed Salafiyya met their end while opposing it and being killed, the same way that's happening now. Then I published another text which is called the Creed and Way of Muslim Orthodoxy, which includes the three major creedal formulations. That came out and was published, and it was Arabic and English, but it had facing pages. So Arabic was on one page, English on the other. Again, Arab co-religionists prevailed upon me to have it Arabic paragraph, English paragraph, and to have it systematic in this way. So I have taken their requests on board, and I'm in the process of doing that. So these should be released and ready before the next Ramadan. We've just finished Ramadan not long ago, so we're probably looking at a year before this is done. And then my next two projects I'm working on are, there's a translation I'm doing of Imam Abdul Ghani al-Lubadi, who died 1319 in Marja. He was the last one to see Mecca whole, the lands of Mecca and al-Medina whole, before Salafis took control in 1924. His book is called Dalil Nasik, and it's a detailed exposition on carrying out Hajj. And it should be ready before Ramadan next year, if Allah protects. And then we have Umdatul Ahkam, which is soon, the translation is almost done. It's a book on Hadith by Abdul Ghani ibn Abdullah al-Maqdisi, which covers the Hadith of Ahkam. It's an extremely useful work for students of knowledge. I've not seen in English any translation that was sound, and the Arabic was also sound along with it. I've not seen any. So this had to be remedied, and the way to remedy that was to release it. And so if Allah preserves, there should be second editions of our previous published works coming out in Arabic, and then new interlinear Arabic English texts, one on Hajj and one on Hadith, coming at you soon.
Okay. Jazakallah, Allah reward you. That was a very, very insightful, informative interview. And inshallah, there will be another episode of the Forward, another inshallah episode with you, Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far, very soon, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.